My daughter sent out 52 Christmas invitations to every relative, but my name was missing from every single one. I said nothing. I simply placed the cards on the table and waited. 3 days later, my grandson called and whispered, "Grandpa, why isn't your name on the guest list?" I smiled calmly and replied, "I don't need to be there because that party won't end the way they expect." What my daughter didn't know was that my next move would expose the secret she had been hiding for months. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Your country, your city, I genuinely want to know. You're part of the Dad Family Revenge family now, and that means something to me. Please note, this story includes fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is purely coincidental, but everything it teaches you is worth carrying. The box was small enough to carry with one hand. I found it on the front porch of my house on Altadena Drive on a Tuesday morning in early December. Sitting just to the left of the welcome mat Carol had picked out 17 years ago, the one with the faded sunflowers she refused to replace. Because, as she used to say, things that had been loved didn't need to look new to still be worth keeping. Emily had called the week before and asked if I would mind dropping it at the post office. She said she had ordered the invitations printed and shipped to my address by mistake, the old family address, the one she had grown up with, the one that her hands apparently still typed on autopilot when she wasn't thinking carefully. She needed them mailed before the end of the week. I had told her, of course. It was the kind of small errand I had always been glad to do, the ordinary texture of being a father, and I had not thought anything of it. I was 68 years old. I had spent 34 years designing load-bearing structures for a civil engineering firm in Los Angeles. I knew how to look at something and determine within a reasonable margin whether it would hold or whether it would fall. That morning, standing on my porch in the cold December air with that small box in my hands, I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain exactly, more like the sensation you get when you step onto a floor and feel just barely the faint give beneath your foot that tells you the foundation is not what it used to be. I carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. Inside were 52 Christmas cards. They were beautiful cards. Cream-colored envelopes, Emily's handwriting on each one, the kind of careful cursive she had inherited from Carol and never fully acknowledged. I recognized the names before I even opened the envelopes. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Howard, the Delgado cousins from Riverside, Margaret, my older sister up in Long Beach. People I had known for decades, people who had sat at our Thanksgiving table and held Emily when she was small enough to be held. I opened the first envelope, then the second, then the third. I was looking for my name. I told myself it was there. I told myself I had simply missed it, that it was tucked somewhere in the middle of the stack, that Emily had addressed it to Dad. The way she sometimes did, that there had been a printing error, a sorting mistake, some perfectly ordinary explanation that would make me feel foolish for having worried at all. By the time I reached the final card, my hands were no longer quite steady. There was no card addressed to Richard Hayes. No card addressed to Dad. No card addressed to Grandpa, which is what Noah had started calling me 3 years ago, and which I had never once told him I loved hearing because I was 68 years old and not the kind of man who said things like that out loud. 52 cards. 52 people invited to sit at my daughter's table on Christmas Eve, and not one of them was me. I stood at the kitchen table for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs in a way I had not felt since the morning the doctor used the word terminal in a sentence about Carol. My throat tightened. My eyes burned at the corners, that specific humiliating burn that comes before tears. You are not willing to shed, not yet not standing alone in your kitchen at 8 in the morning with December light coming through the window above the sink. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Carol's chair, the one she had sat in every morning with her coffee and her crossword puzzle, and her absolute refusal to start a conversation before 7:30, and I sat down. I did not call Emily. I want to be clear about that. I did not pick up the phone and dial her number. I did not fire off a text message asking what this meant. I did not stand in my kitchen and feel sorry for myself because self-pity was a luxury I had never been able to afford, and was not about to start purchasing at 68. Instead, I sat in Carol's chair, and I looked at those 52 envelopes spread across the kitchen table, and I did what I had spent 34 years learning to do when something didn't add up. I started paying attention, because here is what I understood, sitting there in the December quiet of a house that still smelled faintly of the lavender soap Carol had kept by the bathroom sink. A man who builds things for a living knows that most failures don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning signs and flashing lights. They begin with something small, a hairline crack in a support beam, a subtle shift in the grade of a foundation, a detail that looks fine on the surface until you know exactly what you are looking at. 52 invitations. 0 for me. That was not a mistake. That was a measurement. And whatever it was measuring, I intended to find out. I stacked the envelopes back into the box, set the box on the counter beside the coffee maker, and poured myself a second cup. Then I sat back down in Carol's chair, wrapped both hands around the mug the way she used to do on cold mornings, and I began to think. 3 days passed. I want you to understand what 3 days of silence looks like when you are 68 years old and living alone in a house built for more people than currently occupy it. It looks like coffee going cold on the counter because you forgot you poured it. It looks like the television on in the background, not because you are watching it, but because the alternative is listening to a house that has too many rooms and not enough voices. It looks like picking up your phone 14 times and setting it back down without dialing anyone, because you have spent enough years building things to know that you do not pour a foundation when the ground beneath it is still shifting. During those 3 days, I did not call Emily. What I did instead was go back through old text message threads on my phone. Messages from the past several months. Messages where Emily had mentioned Thanksgiving plans, Christmas plans, family gatherings. I read them the way I used to read engineering specifications, slowly looking not for what was there, but for what was missing. And the more I read, the more I noticed a pattern I had not seen before, because I had not been looking for it before. Emily had been busy. Not busy in the ordinary way, busy in the specific, deliberate way of someone who has been preparing something for a long time. I was still sitting with that thought on the 3rd morning when my phone rang. The number on the screen was Noah's, my grandson. 14 years old, all sharp elbows and quiet observations, the kind of kid who noticed things adults assumed children didn't notice. I felt something loosen in my chest when I saw his name, not relief exactly, but something close to it. The particular warmth you feel when someone you love reaches for you before you have to reach for them. I answered on the 2nd ring. "Hey, buddy." His voice came through tight and careful, the way voices get when someone is trying very hard to sound normal. "Hey, Grandpa. How are you doing?" "I'm doing fine," I said. "How about you?" "I'm okay." A pause. Then quieter. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "You can always ask me something." Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, working himself up to whatever it was he needed to say. My chest tightened. Noah was not a child who hesitated. He was the kid who asked the question everyone else in the room was thinking, and nobody had the nerve to say out loud. Whatever was sitting in his throat right now, it was heavy enough to slow him down. "Mom sent out Christmas cards," he finally said. Invitations, I mean. For the party on Christmas Eve. I know, I said. I received the box. You got the box. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not breaking, just bending the way a green branch bends before it decides whether to hold. So you saw the list inside. The guest list. I saw it. Grandpa. His voice dropped so low I had to press the phone harder against my ear. Why isn't your name on it? I looked across the kitchen at the box, still sitting on the counter where I had left it 3 days ago. 52 envelopes. The winter light was coming through the window at a low angle the way it did in December in Pasadena, falling across the counter in a long, thin strip that stopped just short of Carol's chair. I smiled. I want to be honest with you about that smile because it was not a happy smile, and it was not a bitter smile. It was the smile of a man who has just received confirmation of something he already suspected. The quiet, settled feeling of the structural engineer who ran the numbers twice and got the same answer both times. I don't need to be on that list, Noah, I said. I heard him pull in a sharp breath. What do you mean you don't need to be on it? You're her dad. You're my grandpa. You come every single year. You've never missed Christmas, not once, not ever. That's right, I said. I haven't. Then why? His voice cracked again, harder this time, and I heard him swallow against it, fighting to keep himself steady. His hands were probably shaking. Noah always got shaky hands when he was upset. He had inherited that from Carol, who used to grip the edge of the kitchen counter when something scared her. Mom said you didn't want to come. She said you told her you needed space this year. The smile faded, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it said out loud, hearing the specific shape of the story that had been constructed and handed to a 14-year-old boy as fact, made something harden in the center of my chest that I knew was going to stay hard for a while. Noah, I said carefully, has there ever been a single Christmas where I didn't show up? His answer came fast and certain without a moment of hesitation. No, sir. Then what does that tell you? He went quiet. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone whose mind is moving fast, turning something over and looking at it from different angles. Carol used to go quiet the same way. It had taken me 11 years of marriage to learn the difference between the quiet that meant she was done talking and the quiet that meant she was about to say something important. Grandpa, Noah said finally, his voice barely above the whisper. What are you going to do? I looked at those 52 envelopes one more time. Then I looked out the window at the bare branches of the sycamore tree Carol had planted in the front yard the year Emily was born. It was December, and the tree had dropped every single one of its leaves, and it was still standing. I'm going to listen, I said. And then I'm going to act. Because that party, Noah, that party is not going to end the way your mother is planning for it to end. I heard his breath catch. What do you mean? I said that the people who think the quiet ones aren't paying attention are always the most surprised when the quiet ones show up. Margaret called the following afternoon. My older sister had lived in Long Beach for 32 years, in a yellow house 3 blocks from the water that she had shared with her husband Gerald, until Gerald passed from a heart attack 6 years ago. Since then, she had lived alone the way people live alone when they have chosen to make peace with it, not unhappily, but not without cost either. She called me every Sunday at 5 o'clock, reliable as a tide, and she had done this for 6 years without missing a single week. When her name appeared on my phone on a Wednesday afternoon, I knew before I answered that something was sitting in her chest that could not wait until Sunday. Richard. Her voice carried that particular careful quality, the one she reserved for conversations she had been rehearsing before she made the call. "I got Emily's invitation this morning." "I know," I said. "She sent them out to the whole family." I read the guest list. A pause. Her breath came slightly uneven the way it did when she was managing something. "Richard, will you do something for me? Will you let me read it to you out loud right now, every single name?" I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down. "Go ahead, Margaret." She started reading. She read slowly and carefully, the way our mother used to read scripture, giving each name its full weight, not rushing past anyone. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Howard, the Delgado cousins, the Harmon family from Pasadena, Gerald Jr. and his wife, her own name. Cousins I had not seen in years, but whose faces I could still place without effort. People who had stood at Carol's funeral 8 months ago and pressed my hand and told me they were sorry. I listened to every name. I counted. When she reached the end of the list, Margaret stopped. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, shallow and tight, the kind of breathing that happens when your chest is working harder than it should have to. "Did Richard," she said, and her voice broke clean in half on my name, cracking the way old wood cracks, not slowly, but all at once. I read every single name on that list. I read it twice. And I need you to tell me I missed something because I cannot find your name anywhere on it. My throat tightened. I pressed my back molars together and held it the way you hold a beam in place while the adhesive sets. "You didn't miss anything, Margaret." She made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a gasp and a sob. A sound I had not heard from my sister since the night Gerald died, and I drove down to Long Beach and sat with her in her kitchen until 3 in the morning. Her voice when it came back was shaking. "How many names?" I asked her quietly. She counted. I could hear her lips moving through the phone, the faint sound of her finger tracing the paper. 52, she said. 52 people on that list. 52 people, I said. And not one of them is me. "Richard, I don't understand." Her voice climbed with the particular anguish of someone who understands perfectly, but cannot yet bring herself to say the thing she understands. "This is your family. These are your people. Half these cousins, you were at their weddings. You held their babies. How does your name simply not appear on Margaret?" I kept my voice level, not cold level, the way you speak to someone standing on uncertain ground when you need them to stay still. "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," she said immediately, and I heard the fierceness underneath the tears in her voice. The older sister who used to walk me to school and told me once when I was 7 and terrified of a kid twice my size that fear was not a reason to turn around. "You tell me what you need. I need you not to call Emily," I said. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not yet." The silence that followed was not an empty silence. I could feel her pushing against it from the other side, every instinct she had straining toward the phone, toward Emily's number, toward the confrontation that every decent person wants to have when they discover something indecent has been done to someone they love. "Richard," she said carefully. "Why?" "Because I need to understand the full shape of this before anyone starts asking questions out loud," I said. When you confront a problem before you understand it completely, you give the problem a chance to change its shape. And right now, I am still learning what shape this is. Margaret let out a long, unsteady breath, the kind that takes the last of your composure with it on the way out. "She's my niece," she said. "She's been my niece since she was born. I love that girl. I do not want to believe that she—" "I know." My chest ached with the specific weight of a grief that has no clean name, not anger, not sorrow. Something older and more complicated than either. I don't want to believe it either. But wanting and knowing are two different rooms, Margaret. And right now, I need to make sure I am standing in the right one. Another long breath from her end. Then quieter. What are you going to do? I looked at the box on the counter. 52 envelopes. The December light had shifted, moving off the counter, now retreating toward the far wall, the way afternoon light retreats in winter, slowly at first, and then all at once. I'm going to find out exactly what has been decided, I said, and by whom and when and why. And then I am going to make sure that every single person in that family understands the truth before this Christmas is over. Margaret's breath caught. Her voice when she spoke again was steadier, not because she felt better, but because my older sister had always been the kind of woman who steadied herself when someone she loved needed her to. You call me, she said firmly. Whatever you find out, you call me first. You hear me? I hear you, Margaret. I mean it, Richard. You do not handle this alone. I won't, I said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house settled around me the way old houses settle, small sounds, familiar sounds, the particular creaks and sighs of a structure that had been standing long enough to have its own language. I had learned that language over 31 years. I knew what this house sounded like when it was content, and I knew what it sounded like when something was wrong. That afternoon, it sounded like something was wrong. I reached across the table and pulled the box of envelopes toward me. 52 names. Every branch of this family represented every cousin and aunt and uncle and family friend, every person whose number was in my phone and whose face I would recognize on any street in any city. Every person except one. That was not a printing error. That was not an oversight. That was arithmetic, clean, deliberate, and precise. And I had spent 34 years working with numbers precise enough to tell me exactly what they meant. I stood up, rinsed my coffee mug in the sink, and went to find my laptop. I started with Howard. My uncle was 74 years old and had lived in the same house in Glendale for 40 years. A man of fixed habits and predictable opinions, who answered his phone before the second ring and always opened a conversation the same way with the same 4 words he had used since I was a child. Richard, how you doing? Not a question. A greeting. Howard did not ask questions he did not already believe he knew the answer to. I'm doing all right, Howard, I said. I wanted to call and catch up. It's been a while. It has. A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. You know, Emily mentioned you'd been keeping to yourself lately. Said you needed some quiet time after everything with Carol. I wrote that down on the notepad I had placed on the kitchen table before making the call. Keeping to yourself. Needed quiet time. After everything with Carol. Did she? I said. Sure. She called maybe 3-4 weeks back. Said you weren't really up for big gatherings this year. I figured that made sense, you know, first Christmas without Carol and all. Another pause. You doing okay, Richard? Really? I'm doing fine, I said. Thank you for asking, Howard. After I hung up, I called Aunt Patricia. Patricia told me Emily had stopped by in person in early November, in person, not just a phone call, and had sat at Patricia's kitchen table for the better part of an hour. She described Richard as withdrawn, forgetful sometimes, not quite himself since the loss. Patricia had patted Emily's hand and told her that grief did strange things to people, and that Richard just needed time. I wrote that down too. Withdrawn, forgetful, not quite himself. I made 4 more calls over the next 2 hours. Every single person told me a version of the same story. The names changed. The specific words shifted slightly the way a story shifts when it passes through different mouths, but the core of it stayed identical. Richard was struggling. Richard had pulled back from the family. Richard, in the gentle and careful phrasing Emily had apparently used with everyone, was not really himself anymore. By the time I set the phone down after the sixth call, my jaw ached from holding it tight. My hands were steady, I had made sure of that, but my chest felt like something had been poured into it and left to harden. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a daughter who had said one careless thing to one person and watched it spread. This was a campaign, careful, patient, and thorough, conducted over months, reaching every branch of this family before a single envelope had been addressed. I sat with that for 60 seconds. Then I picked up the phone again. I found the number for her Harland Property Group in the email I had located on the family account the night before, an account Jason had used during Carol's illness to manage household correspondence, an account he had apparently forgotten I still had access to. The email thread was brief and businesslike. A property on Altadena Drive, an assessment, a timeline. I dialed. A woman answered on the third ring, bright and professional. Harland Property Group, this is Melissa. How can I help you today? Hi, Melissa, I said, keeping my voice easy and unhurried, the voice of a man with no particular urgency. I'm calling because I'm looking at properties in the Altadena Drive area, Pasadena, around the 600 block. I understand there may be something coming available in that neighborhood. I was hoping to get a sense of the timeline. I heard her typing. A brief pause. Let me just check here, she said pleasantly. Then, yes, we do have a property in that area currently in the authorization phase. It hasn't gone to full listing yet, but we're expecting it to move to active status shortly after the new year. My grip tightened on the phone. I kept my voice level. Can you give me the address? I want to make sure it's the area I'm thinking of. More typing. Then she read it back to me. 4 words. A number and a street name. My address. My house. The house Carol and I had bought in 1991. The house where Emily had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. The house where I had replaced the kitchen faucet 3 times and repainted the back porch twice, and spent one entire weekend in 2008 replacing the water heater while Carol brought me coffee and told me I was doing it wrong. Sir, Melissa said. Does that sound like the right area? I cleared my throat. Yes, I said. That's exactly the area I was thinking of. Thank you for your help. I ended the call. I set the phone on the table. I pressed both palms flat against the wood, the way you press your hands against a surface when you need to feel something solid beneath you, when the ground has shifted enough that you need to remind yourself it is still there. This was no longer a question of a missing name on a guest list. This was something else entirely. The email account had been set up in the fall of Carol's first treatment cycle. It was a shared account. Not mine, not Jason's, but a household account we had created so that Jason could manage the appointment confirmations, the insurance correspondence, the prescription refill reminders that came in faster than either Carol or I could keep track of during those months. It had been Jason's idea, and at the time I had been grateful for it. At the time I had been grateful for anything that meant Carol could rest instead of sitting at a computer parsing medical billing codes at 10 o'clock at night. I had not accessed that account in over a year. Jason knew that. He had been the one managing it since Carol's first hospitalization, and I suspect he had simply concluded, as people do when they believe someone is no longer paying attention, that a door left unopened long enough becomes a door that no longer needs locking. The property documents lived in that account. The insurance files, The deed scans Carol had uploaded during the refinancing in 2019. It was the most convenient place to work from, and convenience, I have learned, makes people careless. Jason apparently had continued to use it. I opened the laptop at the kitchen table and typed in the password. Carol's mother's maiden name, followed by the year Carol was born. A combination so characteristically Carol that I had to stop for a moment after I typed it. My fingers resting on the keys, my chest doing something complicated that I did not have a name for. I typed Harland into the search bar. 14 emails appeared. I read them in chronological order, the way you read a set of structural drawings, starting from the foundation and working up. The earliest email was dated 4 months ago. It was from Jason to a man named Grant Harland, introducing himself as the authorized representative of the property owner and expressing interest in a confidential pre-market assessment. Confidential. Pre-market. Authorized representative. I read those 3 phrases twice. Then I opened the attachment. It was a property assessment for the house on Altadena Drive. 4 pages. Photographs. I recognized the front porch, the back garden, the kitchen Carol had insisted on renovating in 2015 because, as she had put it, a woman spends enough time in her kitchen that it ought to make her happy to stand in it. The assessed value was listed at $2,100,000. At the bottom of the assessment on the final page was a signature line. The name printed beneath it was Richard Hayes. The signature above it was not mine. I had signed my name approximately 10,000 times in 68 years of living. I knew my own signature the way I knew the floor plan of this house, not by looking, but by feel. And what was on this page was not mine. It was close. It was careful. But it was wrong in the ways that only the person whose name it was would immediately recognize, the way a copy of a key looks identical until the moment you try to put it in a lock. I sat back in my chair. My heart was not hammering the way it had on the morning I found the box of envelopes. It was doing something quieter and more deliberate, a slow, heavy rhythm like the sound of a door closing in a large and empty room. I closed the laptop. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked down the hallway to Carol's study, the small room at the back of the house that had been hers completely. The room I had not changed since she died. Not the arrangement of the books on the shelves or the reading lamp on the desk, or the small ceramic dish she had kept her reading glasses in, even though she could never remember where she had put them. I opened the middle drawer of her desk. I had opened this drawer perhaps 3 times in the past 2 years, and each time I had done it quickly, looking for something specific, and closed it again before I could spend too long looking at what else was inside. That evening, I opened it and looked. There was a pen, a small notebook with a rubber band around it, a folded insurance document from 2 years ago, and at the back of the drawer, tucked beneath the notebook, a small envelope. No name on the outside, just my handwriting. No, not my handwriting. Carol's. My name in Carol's handwriting on a small cream envelope that had been sitting in the back of that drawer for God only knew how long. My hands were not steady when I picked it up. They were shaking the way hands shake when the body understands something, before the mind has finished catching up, a fine involuntary tremor that started at my fingertips and moved up through my wrists and would not stop no matter how hard I pressed my palms together. I opened the envelope. 1 page. Her handwriting, the careful, slightly compressed cursive she used when she was writing something she wanted to get exactly right. Richard, it began. If you are reading this, then I am not there to say it to you in person, which means there are things I should have said sooner and did not. I was never good at saying the difficult things out loud. You know that about me? You have always known that about me. Keep the house. Whatever happens, whatever anyone tells you, whatever reasons they give you, keep the house. It is not just a house. You know what it is. And if someone tries to take it from you, I want you to remember that you are the most patient, most precise, most quietly determined man I have ever known. You do not lose things, Richard. You put them down sometimes, but you do not lose them. I love you. I always will, Carol. I stood in that small room for a long time, with that piece of paper in my shaking hands, and the reading lamp casting its small circle of light across her desk, and the night pressing in against the window, and something in my chest that was not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something that felt underneath the grief remarkably like resolve. She had known. Not everything, not the specifics, but she had known enough to write this down and leave it where I would find it. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I went back to the kitchen, sat down at the laptop, and called Daniel Avery. Daniel Avery answered on the first ring the way he always had. We had known each other for 31 years, met at a project management seminar in Burbank in 1994, back when Daniel was still doing contract work for a developer in Arcadia, and I was 3 years into my job at the engineering firm. We had stayed in touch the way men of a certain generation stay in touch, not frequently, not with any particular ceremony, but reliably. Christmas cards, the occasional lunch on Colorado Boulevard, a phone call when something happened that required the kind of conversation you could only have with someone who had known you long enough to skip the preliminary explanations. "Richard," he said, "it's late. What's going on?" "I need to meet with you tomorrow," I said. "I have documents I need you to look at." A pause, not a long one. Daniel was not a man who needed long pauses. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that have my signature on them," I said, "that I did not sign." The pause that followed this was longer. "I'll clear my 10 o'clock," he said. I spent the next morning at the kitchen table with the household files spread out in front of me. Carol and I had kept paper records of everything: deeds, tax filings, insurance policies, the original purchase contract from 1991. She had organized them in a series of manila folders inside a fireproof box she had bought at a hardware store in 2003 and labeled in her careful handwriting, "House." She had believed in paper. She had not trusted anything important to exist only on a screen. I pulled the original deed from the folder. Carol and I had purchased the house as joint tenants with right of survivorship, the standard arrangement for married couples in California, which meant that when Carol died, full ownership had transferred to me automatically and immediately, without the need for probate court, without attorneys or filings or waiting periods. The house had been mine completely and solely from the moment Carol took her last breath in the upstairs bedroom on a Tuesday morning in April. Emily's name was not on the deed. It had never been on the deed. Jason's name was not on the deed. It had never been on the deed. I set the original deed on the left side of the table. Then I printed the authorization document from the email account and placed it on the right side. I positioned them so the signature lines were aligned, and I sat down and looked at them the way I used to look at 2 sets of structural drawings when I needed to find a discrepancy, systematically starting from the left, moving right, comparing each element in sequence. The capital R in Richard. Mine leaned to the right at approximately 15 degrees. The signature on the authorization document leaned to the right at closer to 10. A small difference. The kind of difference that would not register to someone who had never looked at my signature with the specific intention of verifying it. The H in Hayes. Mine had a crossbar that sat in the upper third of the letter. The authorization document's crossbar sat precisely in the middle. Again, small. Again, exactly the kind of detail that only matters when it matters. I placed a sheet of blank paper over the authorization signature and traced it carefully with a pencil. Then I held it up against the window where the morning light came through, strongest, laid it over my own signature on the deed, and held them up together. They did not match. I sat back down. My jaw was tight. My shoulders ached in the specific way they ached when I had been holding tension in them for longer than I had realized. I rolled my neck, slowly heard the small, familiar pop of a 68-year-old body registering its objections, and reached for my coffee. The coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. At 9:45, I put the documents into a manila folder, put the folder into the leather portfolio I had carried to client meetings for 20 years, picked up my jacket from the hook by the door, and checked that the inside pocket still held Carol's letter. It did. I drove to Colorado Boulevard with the radio off. Pasadena in December had a particular quality of light, thin and precise, the kind of light that showed you the edges of things more clearly than summer light did, that stripped away the softness and left the structure. I had always liked December light for that reason. It showed you what you were actually looking at. I parked in the structure on the corner, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked into Daniel's office at 2 minutes before 10. His assistant, a young woman named Grace, who had worked for him for 11 years, and who greeted me by name, because Daniel's long-term clients all knew each other, by now looked up from her desk with a smile that shifted almost imperceptibly when she saw my face. "He's expecting you," she said. "Go right in." Daniel was standing when I entered, which meant he had heard me in the hallway. He was a tall man, slightly stooped now, in the way that tall men sometimes stoop after 60, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular expression of someone who has spent 3 decades in rooms where people brought him their worst problems and has learned to receive those problems without letting his face do anything unhelpful. He extended his hand. I shook it. "Sit down, Richard," he said. "Tell me everything." I talked for 20 minutes without interruption. Daniel was good at that, at receiving information, without inserting himself into it, at letting a person finish before he began to respond. It was one of the things that had made him an effective attorney for 30 years, and one of the things that had made him, in a quieter way, a good friend. He sat across the desk from me with his reading glasses down from his forehead now and onto his nose, and he looked at the documents I had placed in front of him, and he did not say a word until I had said everything I had to say. When I finished, the office was quiet except for the sound of traffic on Colorado Boulevard 4 floors below us and the faint hum of the building's heating system doing its work. Daniel picked up the authorization document. He held it at arm's length, the way people hold things when they are trying to see them clearly rather than closely. Then he set it down and picked up the copy of the original deed. He went back and forth between them 3 times, and each time he went back to the authorization document, the line between his eyebrows deepened slightly. He set both documents down. He took his glasses off. "Richard," he said, "this signature is not yours." My chest tightened so sharply it almost felt like a physical impact. Not because I hadn't known, but because hearing it said out loud by someone whose professional judgment I trusted completely was a different thing entirely from knowing it myself. My hands pressed flat against my thighs beneath the desk. My throat worked once before I could get words out. "No," I said. "It is not." "Do you know who signed it?" "I have a strong suspicion," I said. "I can't prove it yet." Daniel nodded slowly. The nod of a man who has heard this particular sentence many times and knows exactly what it means and what it does not mean. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not avoiding the conversation I knew, but organizing it. "All right," he said. "Let me tell you what you're looking at legally." He leaned forward again, forearms on the desk, and his voice shifted into the register I had heard him use before, careful and precise, the voice of someone who understood that the words he chose in the next few minutes were going to matter. Falsifying a signature on a real estate authorization document is a crime under California Penal Code Section 470. That covers the forgery of any legal document, deeds, contracts, instruments of authorization. It is a wobbler offense, which means it can be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the circumstances and the dollar value involved. Given that we are talking about a property assessed at over $2 million, the district attorney would almost certainly pursue this as a felony. We are looking at potential prison time of up to 3 years, plus fines, plus civil liability. I absorbed that. My jaw was tight. The back of my neck felt hot. And the transaction itself? I asked. Void, Daniel said simply. A document signed under a forged authorization is legally unenforceable in California. The entire transaction can be unwound. But, he held up one finger, we need to be careful about how we proceed. Tell me. If we go to the investigators today, right now, this morning, the person who did this gets a warning before we have a complete picture. People with experience moving money around have a tendency to become very difficult to locate when they understand the walls are closing in. He paused. I want to do some research before we file anything. I want to know exactly who we are dealing with. How long do you need? Give me until tonight, he said. I'll call you. I drove home on the 210 freeway, with both hands on the wheel and the radio still off. The San Gabriel Mountains were visible to the north, clear and closed the way they get in December, when the Santa Ana winds have pushed the air clean. I had lived in the shadow of those mountains for 34 years. I knew their silhouette the way I knew the floor plan of my own house, not by looking, but by feel. My phone rang at 7:43 that evening. I found something, Daniel said without preamble. Tell me. Jason Cross has incorporated and dissolved 3 separate limited liability companies in New York and New Jersey over the past 5 years. A pause. 3 companies, Richard. Started, operated briefly, and then closed before any of them accumulated significant legal liability. It is a pattern. It is a very specific pattern that I have seen before, and it belongs to a category of person who understands from experience how to step away from a structure before it falls on him. My hand tightened on the phone. He has done this before, I said. Not this specifically, Daniel said carefully. But the instinct behind it, yes. This is not someone who is improvising. This is someone who knows how exits work. I looked across the kitchen at Carol's letter sitting on the counter where I had placed it when I got home, her handwriting visible through the paper in the lamplight. Keep the house. Then we do not give him the chance to use one, I said. No, Daniel said. We do not. Before I tell you what my 14-year-old grandson did next, something that changed everything. Drop the word "still" in the comments right now. It tells me you are here, and it tells me this story is finding the people who need it. Just a reminder, some elements in this story have been shaped for educational and entertainment purposes. Details and names may not reflect any specific situation. If this kind of story is not for you, it is completely okay to step away and find something that fits you better. Noah called on a Thursday evening 9 days after I had found the box of envelopes on my front porch. I was in the kitchen making dinner, nothing complicated. Just soup from a can and toast, the kind of meal you make when cooking feels like too much weight to carry alone, when my phone buzzed on the counter and his name appeared on the screen. I turned off the burner and answered before the second ring. Oh, hey, buddy. I kept my voice easy, warm, the way you keep your voice when you can hear from the first syllable that the person on the other end of the line is holding something heavy and is not sure yet whether to put it down. Grandpa. His voice was low, almost a whisper. The particular whisper of someone who is speaking quietly, not because they want to be quiet, but because they are afraid of being overheard. Are you alone right now? My hand tightened slightly on the phone. I'm alone. What's going on, Noah? I heard him pull in a long, unsteady breath, the kind that shakes a little on the way in, the kind that tells you someone has been holding themselves together for longer than they should have had to. I tried to ask Mom, he said. 2 days ago. I told her I wanted to know what was happening with Grandpa, why you weren't going to be at Christmas, what was really going on. A pause. She told me it was adult business, and I didn't need to worry about it. Okay, I said carefully. To Grandpa, I'm 14. His voice cracked on the number, not breaking, but bending hard the way it did when he was angry and trying not to show it. I'm not a little kid. I know when something is wrong. I've known something was wrong for weeks, and nobody will tell me anything, and I just... He stopped. I heard him swallow hard against whatever was climbing up his throat. I got scared. Last night I got really scared. Tell me why, I said. I heard them talking. The words came out faster, now tumbling over each other the way words do when they have been held back long enough that the pressure behind them becomes too much to manage. In the kitchen, after they thought I was asleep, Dad was talking about you, about the house. He said, Grandpa, he said that after Christmas you wouldn't have any options left. The soup on the stove ticked quietly as it cooled. Outside, a car passed on Altadena Drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window and then gone. What did your mother say? I asked. Noah's voice dropped even lower. She asked him if he was sure, and he said he had taken care of everything, and you would understand eventually. A sound escaped him, then not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something in between the sound a 14-year-old boy makes when he realizes the adults around him are capable of things he had not previously understood adults to be capable of. Grandpa, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call you right then because they were still awake and I didn't want them to hear me. So I did something. I don't know if it was the right thing. Tell me what you did, I said quietly. I went back downstairs after they went to bed, he said. And I put my phone in the kitchen drawer, the one next to the stove where Mom keeps the takeout menus. I set it to record, and I left it there, and I went back upstairs, and I waited. My chest contracted. Hard. The specific compression of a heart that is simultaneously breaking and filling with something it does not have a word for, pride maybe, and grief, and something fierce and protective that had no clean name. Noah, I said. I know it might not have worked, he said quickly, his voice tight with the anxiety of someone bracing for disappointment. I know it might not have recorded anything good, but this morning when I checked it, there was Grandpa. There's 7 minutes of them talking. Dad's voice is really clear, and he says... His voice fractured. He pressed through it. He says you won't find out in time. Can you send it to me? I asked. I already did, he said. 2 minutes ago. It should be in your messages. I pulled the phone from my ear and checked. The file was there, a small audio attachment, 7 minutes and 14 seconds. I put the phone back to my ear. Noah. I kept my voice as steady as I could, which was not as steady as I would have liked. You did the right thing. Do you hear me? You did exactly the right thing. He made a sound that was not a word, a single compressed exhale that carried in it every hour of the past weeks. Every unanswered question, every night of lying awake, trying to understand something that no 14-year-old should have to understand about the people who were supposed to be protecting him. Is Grandpa going to be okay? He asked, and his voice was very young when he asked it, younger than 14, younger than the careful composure he had been carrying. The voice of a child who needed the answer to be yes. Oh, Grandpa is going to be more than okay, I said. I promise you that. After I hung up, I sat down in Carol's chair and pressed play. Jason's voice filled the kitchen unhurried, certain the voice of a man who believed completely in the plan he had constructed. I listened to all 7 minutes without moving. When it ended, I sat with the phone in my lap, and the kitchen quiet around me and Carol's letter in my jacket pocket, and a clarity in my chest that felt after weeks of accumulating weight, almost like relief. He had said I wouldn't find out in time. He had been wrong about that. I called Daniel. "The picture just got more complete," I said when he answered. "My grandson recorded a conversation. I need you to tell me what we can use and what we can't." Daniel was quiet for 3 seconds, not hesitating, thinking. "Send me the file," he said. "I'll listen tonight and call you in the morning." Daniel called at 8:17 in the morning. I was already awake. I had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing down everything I knew in the order I had learned it. Not because I needed the notes, but because I had found, over 34 years of engineering work, that the act of writing something down changed the way you saw it. It forced precision. It made the shape of a problem visible in a way that thinking alone sometimes did not. I answered on the first ring. "I listened to the file 3 times, Daniel said. He did not say good morning. This was not a good morning kind of conversation, and we both understood that. Here is where we stand. California is a 2-party consent state under Penal Code Section 632. That means recording a private conversation without the knowledge of all parties is generally prohibited. Noah was not a participant in that conversation. He recorded it from another room, which means this file has limitations. My jaw tightened. How significant are the limitations? In a criminal prosecution, a defense attorney would move to suppress it, and they would likely succeed, Daniel said. It cannot be the foundation of a criminal case. However, a pause the kind Daniel used when the next thing he said was going to matter. In a civil proceeding, the rules of evidence are different. And more importantly, Richard, in a room full of family members on Christmas Eve, it is not a court. The file does not need to be legally admissible to be truthful. What that recording does is tell the truth, and the truth has its own kind of weight that operates entirely outside the rules of evidence. I exhaled slowly. So, we use it at the table, not in the courtroom. Correct, Daniel said. The criminal case, and there will be a criminal case, gets built on the forged document and the financial records. The recording serves a different purpose. Another pause. Speaking of financial records, I spent some time last night looking into Harlan Property Group. I straightened in my chair. And they are a legitimate operation, Daniel said. 15 years in business, licensed in California, no disciplinary history with the Department of Real Estate. They received the authorization document from Jason, conducted a standard surface-level verification, and proceeded in good faith. In a pre-market authorization, where no money has yet changed hands and no listing has gone public, brokerages often accept a signed document without requiring notarization, particularly when the authorizing party is not present. It is not best practice. But it is not uncommon, and Jason understood that. He chose Harlan because he knew how they worked. They did not know the document was forged. They are not co-conspirators, Richard. They are victims of the same fraud you are. Something loosened slightly in my chest. Not relief, something more precise than relief. The satisfaction of a variable resolving to a known quantity. Which means we can cancel the transaction without going through them, I said. Exactly right, Daniel said, and I could hear the particular quality in his voice that I had learned over 31 years to recognize as approval. Under California Civil Code Section 3412, any instrument that was procured through fraud or forgery can be voided by the party whose rights were violated. You are that party. I draft a formal legal notice to Harland informing them that the authorization document in their possession is a forgery and that any transaction proceeding from it has no legal validity. They receive that notice and they stop. They have no choice. No legitimate brokerage firm is going to continue a transaction once they have been formally notified of a forged authorization. It exposes them to liability they have no interest in. And Jason finds out when Harland contacts him to inform him the transaction has been suspended. Daniel's voice was even and measured the voice of a man explaining a sequence of events he had already thought through to its conclusion. He will receive an email or a phone call from Harland, and at that point he will understand that something has gone wrong. But he will not know how wrong. Not yet. Not until we are ready for him to know. I looked out the kitchen window. The sycamore tree Carol had planted stood bare and patient in the December light, its branches sharp against a sky the color of good concrete gray and solid and absolutely reliable. "There is one more thing," Daniel said, "and I want you to hear it carefully." "Go ahead." "I have reason to believe that Jason is aware his timeline is compressed. The pattern of those LLC dissolutions combined with the speed of this transaction, the pre-market assessment, the buyer already identified, the authorization document executed before the property was even formally listed. This is not the behavior of someone who believes he has unlimited time. He is moving fast because he needs to move fast." A pause. "Which means we also need to move. Not recklessly, but deliberately and soon." I turned away from the window. My legal pad was on the table in front of me, covered in the careful handwriting of a man who had learned that precision was the difference between a structure that stood and one that didn't. "What do we need?" I asked, "before we send the notice to Harland?" "Two things," Daniel said. "I want the complete financial picture, whatever else Jason has done with that authorization document beyond the Harland transaction. And I want to know if there is anything else you have not told me yet." I thought of the email thread I had not yet fully excavated, the name Granite Capital Lending that had appeared in a folder I had only briefly opened before closing the laptop to drive to Daniel's office. "There may be something else," I said. "Then find it," Daniel said, "and call me the moment you do." I opened the laptop before the coffee finished brewing. The email account had more in it than I had initially searched. When I had first gone through it 8 days ago, I had been looking specifically for Harland. I had found what I was looking for and stopped there the way you stop reading a structural report when you have located the failure point you suspected. But Daniel had asked me for the complete financial picture, and a complete picture required looking at things you had not initially gone looking for. I typed Granite into the search bar. 6 emails appeared. The first was dated 5 months ago, 2 weeks before the first Harland email. It was from Jason to an address at a company called Granite Capital Lending, with a Glendale address in the signature line. The subject line read, "Inquiry Asset-Backed Short-Term Financing." I read it carefully. Jason had introduced himself as the authorized agent for a property owner in Pasadena. The property on Altadena Drive described in precise detail square footage and lot size and assessed value, all correctly stated. He was inquiring about the availability of a short-term bridge loan collateralized not by a traditional mortgage lien on the property itself, but by the documented authority to execute its sale authority. He explained that had been formally granted to him by the property owner. I sat back in my chair. A hard money lender, the term for private lending companies that operate outside the traditional banking system. Companies that move faster and ask fewer questions and charge significantly higher interest rates in exchange for both of those things would not require the full apparatus of a conventional mortgage. No bank underwriting, no title company involvement, no notarization process that would have required Jason to produce me in person. They would accept a documented authorization to sell as collateral because in a legitimate transaction, that authorization represented real and enforceable value. In this transaction, the authorization was a forgery. I opened the next email. Granite Capital had responded within 48 hours. They had reviewed the authorization document. Jason submitted the same forged document that had gone to Harland and had found it satisfactory for their purposes. They were prepared to offer a bridge loan of $340,000 at an interest rate of 14% annually, with full repayment due in 6 months. $340,000, 14%, 6 months. I did the arithmetic without reaching for a calculator, the way I had always done arithmetic in my head, quickly the way numbers had always arranged themselves for me, with a clarity that other kinds of thinking sometimes lacked. At 14% annually on $340,000, Jason was paying approximately $3,980 per month in interest alone. Over 6 months, that was nearly $24,000 in interest on top of the principal, and the loan had been taken out 5 months ago, which meant repayment was due in approximately 4 weeks. My jaw tightened so hard, I felt it in my temples. I pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the screen and did the larger arithmetic, the kind that was not about dollars and interest rates, but about intent and timeline and the specific shape of a plan that had been constructed around a deadline I had known nothing about. Jason was not simply trying to sell my house to pay off his business debts. He was trying to sell my house to pay off his business debts and repay a hard money loan that was coming due before the end of the year, a loan he had taken out using a forged document as collateral, a loan whose existence would itself constitute evidence of a second count of fraud against a financial institution. He was not running from one problem, he was running from two, and the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was measured not in miles, but in days. I closed the laptop and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "You found something." It was not a question. He had known from the way I had left the conversation that morning that there was something waiting to be found, the way an experienced structural engineer knows from the behavior of a floor that there is something wrong beneath it before he has lifted a single board. Granite Capital Lending, I said. Glendale. He took a bridge loan 5 months ago. $340,000 at 14% 6-month term. Daniel was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them. "The loan is due in 4 weeks, he said. "Give or take," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Richard, this changes the timeline. This is not a man who is trying to solve a problem over the next few months. This is a man who needed the problem solved yesterday." His voice was steady and the voice of someone who had just watched a variable he had been tracking resolve into a number that told him exactly how much time he had to work with. He needs that sale to close before that loan comes due, which means he cannot afford any delay, which means he will not be watching carefully for obstacles, I said, because he cannot afford to slow down long enough to look for them. "Yes," Daniel said. "And that is exactly the kind of mistake a man makes when he is moving too fast." I looked out the window at the bare branches of the sycamore against the December sky. "How quickly can you draft the notice to Harland?" I asked. "I need 2 more things first," Daniel said. "I need to know if there is anything else in that account. And I need to know that we have everything before we move. Because once Harland gets that notice, Jason knows the walls are closing. We do not get a second chance at the element of surprise. Understood, I said. Keep looking, he said. And Richard, be thorough, the way you would be with a set of drawings where you know there is a defect, but you have not yet found every place it appears. I looked at the closed laptop on the table. I will, I said. I drove down to Long Beach on a Friday morning. The 10 freeway west out of Pasadena moved well, at that hour the kind of easy December traffic that makes you forget Los Angeles has another version of itself entirely, one that does not move and does not apologize for it. I kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off and let the drive be what it was, 40 minutes of highway and open sky, and the particular quality of thinking that only happens when you are moving and there is nothing to do but think. Margaret met me at the door of her yellow house before I had finished parking. She had been watching for me. I could tell by the way she was already holding the door open when I came up the front path. Her arms crossed tight across her chest, the way she crossed them when she was cold or worried, or both. Her eyes went to my face, immediately reading it the way older sisters read younger brothers' faces, with the particular fluency of someone who had been doing it for 61 years. Come inside, she said. I made coffee. Her kitchen smelled the way it always had, the same coffee, the same faint trace of the lemon soap she had used for as long as I could remember. The same quality of light through the window above the sink that faced the small backyard, where Gerald had kept a vegetable garden until the year before he died. I sat down at her kitchen table, and she set a mug in front of me, and sat across from me, and folded her hands on the table, and waited. I told her everything. I told her about the email account, and the Harlan correspondence, and the forged signature. I told her about Daniel and California Penal Code Section 470, and the word felony spoken in a quiet office on Colorado Boulevard. I told her about Noah, and the 7-minute recording, and the voice of her nephew by marriage saying the words that a 14-year-old boy had been frightened enough to preserve on a telephone hidden in a kitchen's drawer. I told her about Granite Capital lending and $340,000 and a repayment deadline that was now less than 4 weeks away. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone whose chest was too full to speak immediately, who needed a few seconds to find the opening through which words could come. Her hands on the table tightened against each other, the knuckles going briefly pale. Then she said, "Richard, I need to tell you something." Her voice had changed. It had the careful, slightly unsteady quality of someone who has been holding a piece of information and has just decided, after considerable internal debate, that the time for holding it has passed. "Emily came to see me," she said. "About 6 weeks ago." I set my mug down. "She sat right where you're sitting now," Margaret continued, her voice tightening with something that was equal parts grief and anger, the specific mixture of emotions that comes when you realize you have been used by someone you love. She stayed for almost 2 hours. She had coffee. We talked about Carol, about how much we both missed her, about how hard the first year is. A pause. Her jaw worked briefly. And then she told me she was worried about you. "What did she say?" I asked. My voice was level. My hands under the table were not. She said you had been struggling more than you let on, that you were forgetting things, appointments, conversations, that sometimes when she called you did not seem to know what day it was. Margaret's eyes were bright now, not with tears, but with the particular heat of a woman who has just understood the full shape of something she wishes she had seen sooner. She said she was telling me because she thought the family should know. She said she did not want anyone to upset you by arguing with you about decisions that needed to be made. The coffee in my mug had stopped steaming. I looked at it. "She told you I was losing my mind," I said. "She said it more gently than that," Margaret said, her voice cracking on the last word. "That is what made me believe her, Richard. She said it the way someone says something they wish were not true. She cried. She actually cried sitting at my kitchen table, and I held her hand, and I told her that grief could do strange things to people, and that you just needed time and patience." She pressed her lips together hard. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied itself through what was clearly an act of will. "I feel like a fool." "You are not a fool," I said firmly. "She told you something that had enough truth in it to be believable. I was struggling after Carol died. I did pull back. That part was real. She just built something false on top of something real, and that is harder to see through than a lie built on nothing." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes moved across my face with the careful attention of someone checking their own perceptions against new information. "You remember everything," she said quietly. "You have remembered every detail of everything you have told me this morning. There is nothing wrong with your mind." "No," I said. "There is not." She exhaled a long, unsteady breath that took something with it on the way out. "Why would she do this? What does she gain from people thinking you are not? Because if I try to stop the sale of my house," I said, "and she has already told everyone who knows me that I am confused and forgetful and not quite myself, then any objection I raise can be framed as the behavior of a man who does not fully understand his own situation." I kept my voice even because the alternative was to let it do something I did not want it to do in my sister's kitchen on a Friday morning. It is called undue influence under California Probate Code Section 86. It is a legal strategy used to challenge the validity of a person's decisions by arguing that the person lacked the capacity to make them. Emily was not just telling stories, Margaret. She was building a case. The color left Margaret's face in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "She set up a doctor's appointment," I continued. "Daniel found a reference to it, an email confirmation forwarded through the same household account Jason had been using. Emily had sent the confirmation to Jason through that account, likely because she had been using it to coordinate documents with him and had not thought twice about it. It was addressed to Emily confirming an evaluation appointment at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena. Booked under her name for my evaluation. She has not told me about it. She has not asked my permission. She created it as a resource, something she could point to if I pushed back, and she needed to suggest that my pushback was a symptom rather than a position." Margaret's hands came apart on the table. One of them reached across and gripped my forearm with the particular fierceness of a woman who has just been reminded of something she should never have forgotten. Her grip was stronger than I expected. It always had been. "You tell me what you need," she said. Her voice was not unsteady anymore. "You tell me exactly what you need from me and I will do it." I covered her hand with mine. "I need you in Pasadena on Christmas Eve," I said. "I need you at that table." Emily called on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the backyard when the phone rang, checking the condition of the fence along the east side of the property. One of the posts had been leaning slightly since the last rain, the kind of small maintenance that Carol used to notice before I did, and right on the notepad she kept on the refrigerator under the heading, "Things Richard Needs to Do." I still had that notepad. I had not been able to throw it away. I looked at the screen. "Emily." I took one slow breath. Then I answered. "Hi, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice was warm and careful, in equal measure the voice of someone who had prepared for this conversation before making the call. "How are you doing? I've been thinking about you." "I'm doing fine," I said. "Just checking on the fence out back." One of the posts shifted in the rain. "Oh, you should get someone to look at that," she said immediately. "You don't have to do everything yourself, Dad. That's actually kind of what I wanted to talk to you about." I moved to the back porch and sat down on the top step. The December afternoon light was low and thin, falling across the yard, at the angle that told you winter had fully arrived. I kept my voice easy, unhurried. The voice of a man with nowhere particular to be. "What's on your mind, Emily?" She started slowly asking about my health, my sleep, whether I had been eating properly. Each question landed with the particular gentleness of someone who has been coached or who has coached themselves on how to approach a conversation without appearing to have a destination. I answered each one honestly and without elaboration, and I waited. The destination arrived approximately 4 minutes in. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about the house," she said. "About what makes sense long term. It's a big property for one person, and maintenance alone must be. I just worry about you carrying all of that by yourself." "The house is in good shape," I said. "I know it is. You've always taken such good care of it." A pause. Her voice shifted softer, more careful. "Dad, Jason and I have been talking, and we just think that if you were open to signing some paperwork before the holidays, it could simplify things enormously. For everyone. It would take so much off your plate." There it was. My jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then I released it, the way you release a tool you have been gripping too hard, deliberately, consciously, before the tension in your hand transfers to your work. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. My voice gave away nothing. "Just some authorization documents," she said. "Standard estate planning things. Jason has been working with someone who handles this kind of transition all the time. It's very routine." Routine. I looked out across the backyard at the fence post, leaning slightly east at the winter grass, gone pale and dry, at the place near the garden wall where Carol had planted a Meyer lemon tree 20 years ago that still produced more lemons than 2 people had ever been able to use. "Emily," I said, "I appreciate you thinking about me." "Of course, Dad. I love you. I just want things to be easier for you. I know you do." I kept my voice warm. Genuinely warm, because underneath everything, underneath the forged documents and the granite capital loan and the 7-minute recording and the neurologist appointment booked without my knowledge, she was still my daughter. And whatever Jason had told her, whatever version of this plan he had given her to hold some part of what she felt when she said "I love you" was real. I believed that. I had to believe that. "Let me think about it," I said. "Things have been a lot to process lately. I don't want to rush into anything." She exhaled a small, relieved sound that she probably did not know I could hear. "Of course, Dad. No rush. Just before Christmas would be ideal if you're comfortable." "I'll think about it," I said again. After we hung up, I sat on the back step for a while longer. The lemon tree Carol had planted stood at the far end of the yard, small and stubborn, and still holding a handful of fruit despite the cold. She had loved that tree. She had made lemonade from it every summer and given bags of lemons to neighbors and complained every single year that they had too many lemons and planted it again in her mind the following spring. I pulled out my phone and called Daniel. "Emily just called," I said when he answered. "She asked me to sign authorization documents before Christmas, Jason's paperwork. I told her I needed to think about it." "Good," Daniel said. "Did she give you any specifics?" "No, kept it vague. Standard estate planning. Very routine." I let the last 2 words carry what they needed to carry. Daniel understood immediately. She doesn't know about the forgery, he said. She would not be making this call if she did. Jason told her there was a legitimate process, and she is trying to move it forward. That's what I think, I said. It also means we are still ahead of him, Daniel said. He does not know you know. Keep it that way. I looked at the lemon tree. I intend to, I said. Daniel called at 7 in the morning on the 22nd of December, 3 days before Christmas. I was already dressed. I had slept poorly, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when you are close enough to the end of something that your body refuses to fully disengage the way a structure holds tension in its joints, even after the load has been removed. I answered before the first ring had finished. We have a problem with the timeline, Daniel said. He did not say good morning, neither did I. Tell me. The buyer made their deposit yesterday. $85,000 wired to Harlan's escrow account as a good faith payment. The purchase agreement is scheduled to be executed on the 27th, 2 days after Christmas. A pause, short and deliberate. Richard, we have 72 hours. The number landed in my chest, like a dropped tool hitting concrete, sudden, heavy, and final. What do we need to move? I asked. Everything we have, Daniel said. The forged authorization, the Harlan correspondence, the Granite Capital loan documents, the LLC history, all of it filed simultaneously legal notice to Harlan and a formal complaint to the California Department of Real Estate with copies to the district attorney's office. We do it all at once this morning, so there is no window between notification and response. I was already moving toward the kitchen table where my files were spread. Draft the notice, I said. I'll be at your office in an hour. I called Margaret from the car. She answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert, the way the voices of people who have been waiting for news are always immediately alert. Richard, what happened? The buyer deposited $85,000 yesterday, I said. The sale closes December 27th. We are moving today. Her breath caught a sharp, audible intake that she did not try to hide. What do you need me to do? I need you in Pasadena this afternoon, I said. Daniel's office, 3 o'clock. I'll be there, she said immediately, with the fierce certainty of a woman who had already made her decision 3 days ago at a kitchen table in Long Beach and was simply waiting to be told where to show up. Daniel's office on Colorado Boulevard had a different quality that morning. The same books, the same desk, the same lighthouse print on the wall that nobody had ever looked at directly. But the air in the room was different, compressed. The particular atmosphere of a space where consequential things are about to be decided. Daniel had the notice drafted when I arrived. 4 paragraphs, precise and formal and absolutely unambiguous. It identified the authorization document by date and reference number. It stated clearly that the signature purporting to be that of Richard Hayes was not authentic. It cited California Civil Code Section 3412. It demanded the immediate suspension of all transactions proceeding from the document and the preservation of all related correspondence. I read it twice, then I nodded. Daniel sent it at 11:14 in the morning. Margaret arrived at 3 o'clock, exactly still in her coat. Her cheeks flushed from the December air and something that was not quite cold. She sat across from Daniel and me at the conference table and listened, while Daniel walked her through the sequence, the notice, the complaint, the simultaneous filings, and she asked 3 precise questions that told me she had spent the drive from Long Beach thinking, rather than simply worrying. At 4:27, Daniel's phone rang. It was a contact at Harlan. They had received the notice. They had immediately suspended all activity on the Altadena Drive file. The buyer had been notified that the transaction was under review. The $85,000 deposit was frozen pending verification of the authorization document's authenticity. The room felt different after Daniel set the phone down. "Harland will contact Jason," Daniel said. "Probably today, certainly by tomorrow morning. They will send him an email informing him that the transaction has been suspended, pending an investigation into the authorization document." Margaret leaned forward. "And when he gets that email, he will understand that something has gone wrong," Daniel said. "But he will not know how wrong. Not the full picture. Not yet." He folded his hands on the table. "In my experience, a man in Jason's position, someone who has always found a way to step away from a collapsing structure before it falls, will do one of two things when he receives that email. He will either begin preparing an exit, or he will convince himself it is a manageable complication and wait to see what happens next." "Which do you think he will do?" Margaret asked. Daniel looked at me rather than at her. It was a question he was directing at me. I realized not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to know if mine matched his. "He'll wait," I said. "He needs that sale. Running means losing the money. He will tell himself he can still fix it. He will spend Christmas weekend deciding how, and by the time he understands he cannot, it will be the 25th. Daniel nodded once. "That is my read as well." My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Noah. It read, "Grandpa, I'll be there. Whatever you need." I looked at that message for a moment, at the economy of it, the absolute simplicity of a 14-year-old boy saying the one thing that needed to be said. My throat tightened. I typed back 2 words. "I know." Then I put the phone in my jacket pocket next to Carol's letter and looked across the table at my sister and my oldest friend and thought about the 25th of December and what it was going to require of all of us. 2 days, I said. 2 days, Daniel said. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her grip was strong and steady and certain, and she did not say anything because there was nothing left to say that the grip did not already cover. Christmas Eve came in quietly, the way significant things sometimes do. I had expected to feel something different that night, some heightened alertness, some edge of anticipation that would make the hours move strangely. Instead, the evening arrived like any other December evening in Pasadena, with the temperature dropping after sundown, and the neighborhood settling into the particular stillness of a night, when most people are exactly where they have decided to be. I made dinner from what was in the refrigerator. Eggs and toast and the last of a container of soup Margaret had pressed into my hands when I left her house in Long Beach, saying I needed to eat properly and that she did not trust me to do it without supervision. I ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and the window above the sink showing me the dark shape of the sycamore against the night sky. After dinner, I went into the living room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner by the front window, the same corner where we had put it every year for 31 years, because Carol had decided in our first December in this house that the tree belonged there where it could be seen from the street, where the lights would show through the glass and tell the neighborhood that someone inside was marking the season. I had put it up alone this year for the first time. It had taken me longer than it should have. Not because the process was difficult, but because every ornament I unwrapped from its tissue paper was a conversation, a memory attached to a piece of painted glass or molded plastic that Carol had held in her hands and decided was worth keeping. I sat down in the armchair across from the tree and looked at it for a while. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out her letter. I had read it perhaps a dozen times since the night I found it. I knew every word by now, knew the particular way Carol had formed her capital letters, knew where the pen had pressed harder on the page and where it had moved lightly, knew the place near the end, where her handwriting had shifted almost imperceptibly, as if she had stopped and thought before finishing the sentence. I read it again anyway, The way you return to certain things, not because you need the information, but because the act of returning is itself meaningful. Keep the house. Whatever happens, whatever anyone tells you, whatever reasons they give you, keep the house. I folded the letter and held it in both hands. She had written this 6 months before she died. She had written it knowing she might not be there to say it in person, knowing that the things she was most concerned about were the things she had never been able to say out loud while she was living. Carol had been that way. She could speak easily about almost anything except the things that mattered most to her, which she tended to carry quietly and handle alone until she could not. She had known something was coming, not the specifics. She could not have known about forged documents or hard money loans or a real estate company in Glendale. But she had known enough, had seen enough in the particular way that people who pay close attention see things to understand that the house needed protecting, and that the person most likely to protect it was the man she had spent 31 years trusting to hold things together. I thought about Emily, not with anger. I had moved through anger weeks ago in the first days after finding the envelopes, and what remained on the other side of it was something more complicated and more difficult. A sorrow that had the specific shape of love, because you cannot be genuinely hurt by someone you do not genuinely love. And I had loved my daughter from the moment she was born with a completeness that nothing she had done had succeeded in reducing. I thought about Jason. I thought about a man who had spent 5 years building and dissolving companies, who had learned to construct frameworks and walk away from them before they collapsed, who had looked at my house and my grief and my daughter's loyalty, and had seen in all of those things not a family, but a resource. I did not hate him. Hatred required a kind of sustained attention I was not willing to give him. What I felt instead was something colder and more precise, the assessment of a structural engineer looking at a load-bearing element that had been compromised and deciding what needed to be done about it. I thought about Noah, 14 years old with a telephone in a kitchen drawer, and the good sense to be afraid and the better sense to do something about his fear. Carol would have adored that boy even more than she already did. She would have been proud of him tonight. I stood up from the armchair and walked to the window. Altadena Drive was quiet. The houses up and down the block had their lights on, Christmas lights on porch railings, candles in windows, the warm amber glow of living rooms where families were doing whatever families do on the night before Christmas. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. Somewhere down the block, a car door closed. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. The world entirely unaware of what was going to happen inside one house on the east side of Pasadena tomorrow evening. I checked my jacket pocket one more time. Carol's letter, my phone, the address of Emily's house written on the back of one of Daniel's business cards, though I had known the address for 11 years and did not need it written down. I turned off the living room light. I walked down the hallway to the bedroom. I was not calm exactly, but I was ready, which is a different thing, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of clarity, the state you reach when you have done everything that can be done, and the only remaining task is to show up and do what the situation requires. I set my alarm for 7 o'clock. I lay down in the dark, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept. Before I tell you what happened when I walked through that door on Christmas night, comment the number 68 below. That is my age. That is how old I was when I decided I was not done yet. Let me see you there. Please note the story, continuing from here, contains fictional elements woven in for educational purposes. Any names or places are coincidental, but if you would rather not continue, this is a natural place to pause. No judgment at all. I arrived at Emily's house at 7:13 in the evening on Christmas Day. I had driven the route twice before in my life without thinking about it the way you drive to a place you have been going for years, on roads that have become so familiar, Your hands know the turns before your eyes register the signs. That evening, I drove it deliberately, the way you approach a job site on a day when something important is going to be determined, with attention, with intention, and with the understanding that what happened in the next few hours would not be undone. Daniel was waiting on the street half a block from Emily's house, his car parked under a eucalyptus tree with the engine off. I pulled up behind him, and we got out in the cold December air. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one he wore to depositions, and carrying the leather portfolio I had seen on his desk for 30 years. Noah was already there. He was standing on the sidewalk next to Daniel's car, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. When he saw me, he straightened, an instinctive gesture, the particular physical response of someone who has been waiting and has finally seen the thing they were waiting for. His face was tight with the effort of holding himself steady, and his eyes, when they met mine, were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hey, Grandpa," he said. His voice was controlled and quiet, the voice of a boy who had decided tonight that he was going to be whatever the situation needed him to be. I put my hand on his shoulder, squeezed once. "You ready?" He nodded. One short, certain nod. Emily's house was lit from every window. Even from half a block away, I could hear the low hum of 52 people gathered in one place. The collective sound of a family in full assembly. The particular music of voices and laughter, and the clinking of glasses that I had been hearing at family gatherings for 68 years. The front walk was lined with luminarias, paper bags weighted with sand, and lit from inside with small candles, because Emily had always loved luminarias at Christmas. Carol had taught her that. They had made them together every year when Emily was small, cutting the tops of the bags into shapes, while I pretended not to notice the mess on the kitchen table. We walked up the front path together, Daniel on my left, Noah on my right. I rang the doorbell. A cousin opened the door. Howard's son, a man named Gregory, who was 40 years old and had Carol's same dark eyes, and who looked at me with an expression that moved through several registers in rapid succession before settling into something I can only describe as relieved. He stepped back without a word and held the door open wide. We walked in. The noise of the party met us at the threshold, warm air, the smell of food and candles and too many people in one space, the sound of conversations happening in every room at once. We had been standing on the porch long enough to hear Emily's voice through the closed door, before Gregory opened it, clear and careful, the voice of someone delivering a prepared statement to an attentive room. She had chosen this moment deliberately. We had simply chosen the same one. For 3 seconds, nobody near the entrance registered what they were seeing. 3 seconds of ordinary Christmas, of people talking and laughing and reaching across each other for the serving dishes, completely unaware. Then the first person saw us. Then the second. The quiet spread outward from the entrance, the way quiet spreads in a large room. Not all at once, but in a wave moving from person to person, as each one followed the eyes of the person next to them, until within 15 seconds, the entire first floor of Emily's house had gone from the full noise of a family Christmas party to something close to silence. Across the room, Emily was standing. She had been in the middle of raising a glass, about to say something, about to make a toast, positioned at the center of the gathering, the way she had always been comfortable being positioned. She was wearing a deep green dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and an expression of careful, practiced warmth that I recognized as the face she put on for large gatherings, the social face, the face that was not false, but was also not the whole truth. She saw me. The glass stayed raised for exactly 1 more second. Then her arm lowered slowly, and the expression on her face moved through something. I did not have a name for something between shock and calculation, and underneath both of those, something that looked just briefly like relief. Dad. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I could hear it from across the room, the slight compression of it, the way it lost its prepared quality the moment it actually had to cross the space between us. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the room, at all 52 faces turned toward me. Faces I had known for decades. Faces that had received Emily's version of my story over the past several months and accepted it because they had no reason not to. I saw Howard near the window, his eyebrows raised. I saw a cousin from Riverside with her hand pressed flat against her sternum. I saw Jason standing near the far wall, and I watched the color leave his face in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I looked back at Emily. Emily told you all that I chose to be somewhere else tonight, I said. My voice was level and unhurried, and carried easily across the quiet room, the way voices carry in spaces where everyone has stopped breathing at the same time. She was right about one thing. I made a choice. I paused. I chose not to come to a party I was not invited to. I am here now because I have something to say that this family deserves to hear. And I am here now because this is my family. It has always been my family. And I do not need an invitation to show up for the people I love. Jason took one step toward the hallway. Noah's hand came out of his jacket pocket. His phone was in it. Jason stopped. Daniel walked to the dining table without hesitation. He set the leather portfolio down on the white tablecloth, among the serving dishes and the candles and the half-empty glasses. And he opened it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years putting documents in front of people who did not want to look at them. The room watched him the way rooms watch things they do not yet understand, with a collective attention that was not yet alarm, not yet grief, but something in between. "My name is Daniel Avery," he said in the clear, unhurried voice he used in conference rooms and courtrooms and anywhere else where precision mattered more than comfort. "I am a licensed real estate and estate planning attorney in the state of California. I have been retained by Richard Hayes, and I need about 10 minutes of your time." Nobody moved. Daniel laid the first document on the table. "This is a property authorization document," he said. "It purports to grant Jason Cross full authority to act as Richard Hayes' agent in the sale of the property at And he read the address slowly, clearly, so that every person in that room heard it. "In Pasadena, California. It bears a signature above the name Richard Hayes." He paused. Richard Hayes did not sign this document. The room absorbed that. I watched it move through the people standing closest to the table, the slight shift in posture, the exchange of glances, the particular quality of attention that comes when people realize they are in the middle of something they will be describing to other people for years. Jason's jaw tightened. He was still standing near the far wall, his shoulders pulled back. His expression doing the work of a man who is calculating his options and finding fewer than he expected. Daniel laid the second document beside the first. "This is correspondence between Jason Cross and Harlan Property Group in Glendale, California, a real estate brokerage. Over the past 4 months, Jason Cross used the forged authorization document to engage Harlan in a pre-market sale process for Richard's home. A buyer was identified. A deposit of $85,000 was collected." He paused. "As of yesterday morning, Harlan Property Group has been formally notified that the authorization document is a forgery. The transaction has been suspended. The deposit is frozen." A sound moved through the room. Not a word, something more elemental than a word. The sound a group of people makes when a story they believed turns out to have been a different story entirely. The third document. This is a loan agreement between Jason Cross and Granite Capital Lending of Glendale, California. 5 months ago, Jason Cross used the same forged authorization to borrow $340,000 from a private lending company, using the supposed right to sell Richard's home as collateral. That loan is currently in default. He set the document down. Jason Cross owes approximately $1,740,000 across 2 creditors. He intended to resolve that debt with the proceeds from the sale of a house that was never his to sell. The room was very still. Emily had not moved from where she was standing. Her face had gone through several things while Daniel was speaking. I had been watching it the way you watch something you love and cannot protect from what is coming. First, disbelief. Then a terrible dawning comprehension. Then something that looked like nausea. Her hands were clasped together at her waist, the knuckles white, her fingers pressing against each other, hard enough that I could see the pressure from across the room. Jason. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Jason, what is he talking about? Jason said nothing. I need you to tell me right now that this is wrong, Emily said, and her voice climbed with each word, cracking on the last one. The crack of something that has been under more pressure than it was built to bear. I need you to look at me and tell me that my father's signature is real, that you had his permission, that there is an explanation for all of this that I do not know yet. Jason looked at her. He did not speak. And in his silence, not a dignified silence, not a strategic one, but the silence of a man who has run out of versions of the story, Emily found her answer. Her breath came out in a single broken sound that was not a word and not a sob, but something that contained both of them, something that held inside it every conversation she had believed, every reassurance she had accepted, every moment she had chosen trust over question. Her hand came up and covered her mouth. Her shoulders drew inward. Before I play this recording, Noah said quietly, I want you to know that I know it's not perfect. His voice was steady in a way that surprised me, steadier than I would have been at 14, standing in front of 50 people. I know I probably shouldn't have made it, and I know it might not count for anything in a courtroom. He looked at the room, at the faces of the family he had grown up with. But you deserve to hear it, and it's the truth. He pressed play. Jason's voice filled the room. Unhurried. Certain. The voice of a man explaining a plan he believed in completely to a woman who trusted him completely in a kitchen where he believed no one else was listening. After Christmas, he won't have any options left. He won't find out in time. The recording ran for 40 seconds before Noah stopped it. 40 seconds was enough. Howard made a sound from across the room, low and involuntary. The sound a person makes when something hits them in a place they were not bracing. Somewhere behind me, I heard a woman's voice say Jason's name like a question. Gregory, who had opened the door for us, was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who needed a moment before he could look anywhere else. Jason moved toward the hallway entrance. The California Department of Real Estate has received our complaint, Daniel said without raising his voice. The district attorney's office has received our filing. Granite Capital Lending has been notified of the fraudulent authorization. There is nowhere to go, Jason, that the paperwork has not already arrived at. Jason stopped. He stood in the entrance to the hallway with his back partially to the room, and he stood there for a long moment that I think was the worst moment of his life. The moment when a person who has spent years constructing exits discovers that all the exits have been sealed. Then his shoulders dropped, and he walked down the hallway, and the front door opened and closed. He did not say goodbye to his wife. He did not say goodbye to his son. Emily stood in the middle of the room with 51 people around her, and her hand still covering her mouth and her eyes, when they finally found mine across the space between us, full of something I recognized. Not because I had put it there, but because I had felt it myself in different rooms, at different times, in the long aftermath of understanding that the person you trusted had been holding a different map than the one they showed you. I crossed the room to my daughter. I did not say anything. I put my arms around her, and she folded against my chest the way she had when she was small enough to fold that way, and she cried with the specific, wrenching grief of someone who has just lost two things at once: the man she believed her husband was, and the version of herself that had believed it. I held her and said nothing because there was nothing yet to say, and because some things can only be held before they can be spoken. After a while, Emily stepped back. Her face was wet, and her eyes were swollen, and she looked at me the way people look when they have just been through something that has rearranged them when the version of themselves that walked into a room no longer exists, and the new version has not yet fully arrived. She pressed the back of her hand against her cheek. She took a breath that shook on the way in and steadied on the way out. Dad," she said. Her voice was raw, stripped of everything she had prepared for this evening. "I didn't know about the signature. I didn't know he forged it. He told me you had agreed. He told me you understood." "I know," I said. "I should have asked you myself." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard and held it. "I should have called you and asked you directly, and I didn't, and I don't." She stopped. Her throat worked. "I don't know how to explain why I didn't." "You don't have to explain it tonight," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The room was still quiet. 51 people, all of them watching, all of them understanding by now that whatever was happening between Richard Hayes and his daughter was not finished. That there was one more thing that needed to be said, or shown, or given before this night could begin to close. I took out Carol's letter. Emily's eyes went to it immediately, to the small folded page worn soft at the creases from being opened and refolded a dozen times. She recognized the paper, the particular cream color of it, the size of it. Carol had kept a stationery set in the top drawer of her desk for 30 years, the same brand, the same color, the same weight of paper, and Emily had grown up watching her mother write on it. Her breath caught. "I found this in your mother's desk," I said. "6 weeks ago. She wrote it 6 months before she died." I unfolded it and read it aloud. Not loudly, not performing. Just reading the way you read something that matters, slowly giving each word the space it needed. When I finished, the room was absolutely still. Emily's face had collapsed entirely. Not the controlled grief of earlier, not the manageable tears of someone working through shock, but something older and deeper and more fundamental, the grief of a daughter who has just heard her mother's voice for the first time since her mother died. Coming from a letter she did not know existed, saying things she did not know her mother had known needed saying. She pressed both hands over her face. Her shoulders shook. A sound came from behind her hands that I will not try to describe, because some sounds do not have words adequate to them, and the attempt to find the words only diminishes what the sound actually was. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my pocket. Then I stepped forward and put my arms around my daughter again, and this time she did not fold against me like a child. She held on the way adults hold on, tightly, deliberately, with the full weight of someone who understands exactly what they are holding on to and why. We stood like that for a long time. Nobody in the room said anything. Nobody needed to. The weeks after Christmas moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, time had the quality of compression, every day shorter than it should have been, every hour carrying more weight than hours are designed to carry. After time opened back up, not into ease exactly, but into the ordinary dimensions of a life that has resolved something difficult and is learning slowly what shape it takes now. Jason retained an attorney on the 27th of December. It did not help him. The California Department of Real Estate suspended his license to act as a real estate agent pending investigation. The district attorney's office filed charges under California Penal Code Section 470 felony forgery and under a second count related to the fraudulent loan from Granite Capital Lending. Granite Capital filed their own civil suit the following week. Harland Property Group closed the file on the Altadena Drive transaction permanently and returned the deposit to the buyer. The house on Altadena Drive remained in my name. It had never left. Emily called me on the 3rd of January. Not to explain, not to apologize in the formal, constructed way that apologies sometimes come when people have had enough time to prepare them. She called the way she used to call when she was in college, and something had happened, and she needed to hear a voice she trusted before she could figure out what to do next. "Dad," she said. "Can I come see you?" "You know where I live," I said. She came on a Saturday morning. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had found the box of envelopes 4 weeks earlier, and we drank coffee and we talked for 3 hours. Not about Jason. Not about documents or attorneys or what happened at the party. We talked about Carol, about the things Emily remembered that I had forgotten and the things I remembered that she had not known. About the Meyer lemon tree in the backyard and the luminarias Emily had learned to make at this table and the way Carol had always burned the toast, but refused to admit it was the toaster's fault. At some point, Emily put her mug down and looked at me and said, "I keep thinking about what she wrote. That you don't lose things. That you just put them down sometimes." "She knew me," I said. "She knew me too," Emily said quietly. "Better than I knew myself." We did not resolve everything that morning. Some things do not resolve in a morning or a month or perhaps a year. What we did was begin, and beginning, I have learned, is the part that matters most, because nothing that has been broken can be repaired until someone decides to pick up the first piece. Noah still calls every Sunday, 7 o'clock, without fail. We talk about school and basketball and the things a 14-year-old boy thinks about when the adults around him have stopped making everything complicated. He asked me once, about a month after Christmas, whether I was angry at his mother. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "No," I said. "I'm not angry. I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For her to find her way back," I said. "She will. She just needs time." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grandpa, you're really patient." I thought about Carol, about 31 years, and a Meyer lemon tree, and a notepad on the refrigerator, and a letter in a desk drawer that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to be found. "I had a good teacher," I said. "The house on Altadena Drive is still standing. The fence post on the east side has been repaired. I fixed it myself on a Tuesday afternoon in January, the way I have fixed every small thing this house has needed for 31 years, because Carol was right, that a house tells you what it needs if you are willing to listen, and I have always been willing to listen." Carol's letter is in the drawer of her desk, not in my jacket pocket anymore, back where I found it, where it belongs. I put it back not because I no longer need it, but because I no longer need to carry it with me to remember what it says. Some things, once you have truly understood them, stop needing to be held in your hands. They move somewhere quieter and more permanent, into the part of you that does not forget, that does not waver, that remains exactly where it has always been, regardless of what anyone does to try to move it. Keep the house. I did. I have told you this story not because I am proud of every part of it, but because the parts I am not proud of matter most. For too long I stayed quiet and called it patience. It was not. Silence, when silence is wrong, is just surrender with better posture. Do not wait as long as I waited. The people who love you deserve the truth before it becomes a crisis. I believe God does not waste hard seasons. Carol's letter was not an accident. It was provision left exactly where I would find it when I needed it most. These family stories revenge cannot fully capture alone. They are about something deeper. About refusing to disappear when everything is designed to make you let go. In every family drama revenge story, there is a moment when the person who was written off decides they are not finished. That moment belongs to anyone willing to claim it. The best family drama revenge is not loud. It is patient, precise, and arrives exactly on time. If this story found you, leave a comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who needs it today. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is your sign. More family stories, revenge are waiting for you every single week. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. Some stories here contain fictional elements built with purpose to teach and to remind us what matters. If this content is not for you, we respect that completely. Please choose what serves your heart best.